Hi everyone, it's been a while since my last video, but here I am back again now that everything has calmed down a little bit since the release of We Ride the Storm. So that's been really fun and exciting getting to see people enjoying it and getting pictures of it on bookshelves and stuff. So that's been I still haven't gotten up the courage to go and see it in my local bookstore because I'm sure I will just cry. So hopefully I will get up the courage to do that soon. Until then, it is actually 27 weeks until the second book comes out. So We Lie with Death comes out on the 12th of January in the US and the 14th in the UK. And since there is 27 weeks and 27 chapters of We Ride the Storm, I thought it could be really fun to do like audio commentary. So, like they do on movies, a commentary on, various aspects of the book. So I figure I will do this one chapter a week until We Lie with Death comes out. I think that could be interesting, especially for this book, since this book was originally a self-published, so I can also kind of talk about in each chapter some of the reasons behind things that I did differently in this version compared to the original version. So I'm just going to jump right in at chapter one of the traditionally published version of We Ride the Storm. This one is particularly interesting to me because this chapter one didn't actually exist in the self-published version at all. So we actually started with Ra's chapter, which is chapter 2 in this. So this one was entirely new. So this one is Miko. We have her dragon symbol. She has the dragon symbol because it is the family symbol of the Tsai family. Who she's not technically a blood relation of, but she claims the name, the Emperor's last name. So, warning, if you haven't actually read this, I am kind of obviously going to be going into some spoilers here, so maybe you should read before you watch this each week, so that you're not getting spoilers from me yakking on about the decisions that I made in each of these chapters. So, spoiler warning. All right, so the decision to add the extra chapter was because in starting with Ra's chapter, which, he starts off his, as we will discuss next week, starts off his severing the heads off dead bodies, which gave an overall feeling that the book was going to be a lot darker than it is. Not that it doesn't have its grim moments and that, there isn't plenty of head severing because it is the Levanti death, right? But it kind of just set a tone that didn't entirely go with what ultimately is the overall story of the series. It also meant that we weren't starting in the location where most of the story actually takes place. So the second chapter actually starts in Chiltay, and most of the story takes place in Kisia. So having a story where we were actually starting the first chapter with the right setting, the right tone to show that this is kind of a very large sort of epic scale political, not just about chopping heads off for funsies kind of story seemed like a really good idea. It was actually the suggestion of my editor. So, initially because I had started the entire book with this line that was, it's harder to sever a head than people think. The whole book was born out of that line. So I was initially a little bit resistant to the idea, and it took me a couple of weeks to kind of mull over it and think and go, yeah, actually, I think we do need either to switch the chapters around or to add a new one. And I realized adding a new one was actually the best way to go. But then I had to come up with a new, better line than it's harder to sever head than people think as a way to start a book. So I spent quite a lot of time sitting and staring at my page because I feel like that kind of encapsulates a lot about Ra's culture as well as like him as a person. and kind of some humor into, because there is quite a bit of humor in the darkness of this story. So I needed to kind of come up with something that sort of similarly encapsulated Miko's character. And as I've done, if you have seen my video of reading from this book, I did say that the opening line that we ended up with was, "They tried to kill me 4 times before I could walk," which ultimately is a whole kind of encapsulation of the fact that Miko has spent her life in a kind of dangerous, unwanted situation. So, she is not the blood daughter of the emperor, and that puts her in a really, really difficult position within the court and the empire. So I really wanted to make sure that we got that in there, and was immediately extremely pleased, very pleased with myself. So it's, "They tried to kill me 4 times before I could walk, 7 before I held any memory of the world. Every time thereafter I knew fear, but it was anger that chipped sharp edges into my soul, because she's not only always in trouble, but she uses the anger and the loss to motivate her. That is sort of always been the way she worked. So it was a good fun opening. I also then wanted to set the political scene, which is why I thought, well, we start her next chapter used to start right back up in the castle in Koi, where they were going through the ceremony in which the emperor makes his oath to the people, which he renews each year. So I thought, all right, well, we could do something on the road while they're on the way there. That makes sense. I wanted to give a little bit more time and personality to Ito and Tanaka, who are, Tanaka is her twin, and Ito lives with them as a kind of hostage. So I wanted to make sure that I could get a bit more of them in there, a bit more of a sense of the kind of ongoing struggle between her mother and the emperor, just so that we can get an idea for how dangerous this situation is and always has been for them, and why they are so watchful and worried and secretive all the time. So that was the reason why I went with the, there's a scene at the end where they are on the road and they come across people who are essentially protesting the emperor's various decisions over the time, wanting to know who is going to be the heir. It's pretty much a way of giving voice to the tensions that have been the entirety of Miko's life up until this point. So, rather than looking at what her life has been like for the last, 17 years, I have just tried to encapsulate the idea and the feeling and the tone of what she has experienced through her life into this kind of one chapter and scene. And so I actually wrote the second half of the chapter first. So I wrote this idea of, okay, they're in a carriage, they're traveling, they come across the protesters. This is the kind of push and pull watchfulness that she has going on as she hops out of the carriage. Initially, I wrote it that Tanaka was the one pushing forwards to talk to the people, to be seen. Because he ultimately, later on in the story, is more impatient and pushy. But ultimately, it kind of didn't fit her character in that she was just following along. It's not really a very Miko thing to do. She's always kind of sat in her brother's shadow, because the idea that he would be the one that would get the throne, not her, because, he's a boy and she's not, and this is one of those other things that has constantly chipped anger into her soul that she is motivated by. So I went, no, you know what? No, he is impatient and pushy, but ultimately she is the one with the kind of grand dreams. She wants to be seen, she wants to be an empress, and so she would be the one going, we can do this, and stepping forward. So I changed that she is the one who initially steps forward to talk to the protesters, to be seen, to try to talk them out of blocking the way, etc., etc. Ultimately it all backfires because it's the first chapter of a story and there has to be a story, so it can't go well. And then later on, I realized that I needed something a bit more, some kind of note about her plans, the way she works within the court. And I had by that point started, not only written the second book already, but had started thinking about the third book and was, working on the beginning stages of book 3, and realized that the character of Lady Sitchi Mansion, who, doesn't really get much in the way of page time in the first book, actually becomes important. The further we go. And while there wasn't really much in the way of scope to add her to the first book, to add her more than she was, because she isn't with any of the POV characters for anything barring this moment, I thought this is a really, given the importance she is going to have later on to Miko, I could put her into an opening scene here in which they are both aware of the danger of the situation they are in. They are both essentially, in so many ways, the same person, because they're two women with ambitions and drives and dreams who keep getting stuck in the whole, this is totally a patriarchy kind of situation, and being controlled by men who are more powerful than them, to the point where they don't 100% feel like they can trust each other, that they can't talk to each other, because that level of trust and faith in someone is really easy to manipulate. So they talk around a point rather than having a really direct conversation. And the idea that this story would have gone the whole history of this moment would have gone a completely different way if you look at that scene and they were able to be in a position where they could just be openly honest with each other, not worrying that people were listening to them, not worrying that one of them would betray the other, not having had to live in a society and in a court where they are constantly in danger, and their entire existence is something that they're having to kind of fight for. So I think I liked that idea, that the opportunity to stop a lot of really awful things from happening, if only these two women had been in a position to be open and honest with each other, could have been, was a really, really kind of interesting take on the whole thing. So that was why I ended up adding the scene at the start where Miko gets up early. She goes over to the bathhouse and is ultimately really just looking everywhere for assassins and thinking about her own stuff, when Sitchi comes in and joins her and asks her really very secretively and desperately what her plans are, what she knows, what is going on. And Miko having to make that decision in that moment, am I going to be honest with this? Is that okay? And having to choose not to because it's just too dangerous. Her position is too fragile. And ultimately, even in the moment, almost regretting that Sitchi leaves really soon afterwards to go on her visit to her family, and they're not going to get to actually finish this conversation until she comes back. But of course, everything kind of goes to hell before she is able to come back. So I was really trying to get across a lot of the concepts and the tone. Introduce the important characters to Miko at this point, so we see the Emperor very briefly, we see her mother, well, we see her mother's hand, her mother's influence more than anything, and Sitchi, who, while isn't all that important, very obviously important to this book, her decisions are important to the direction that the book goes, and her decisions ultimately become extremely important further down the line. So I like the idea that this very opening scene, which is probably quite forgettable, in that, she doesn't really show up again for the rest of the book. I think Gideon mentions her at some point further down the line, and she comes up when Minister Mansion talks about her, but ultimately we don't see her again for this book. And I like that idea that ultimately this extremely forgettable scene in Abath is actually indicative of a lot of the future direction that Miko is going in. So, you know, I'm kind of telling you how it's going to go before you even get reading, and then you're just going to forget about it because it's just an unexciting scene in Abath. So, I'm not sure that there's something else I really think is interesting about this chapter. I think mostly it was really just me trying to find a new way to introduce everything because, as I said, it didn't exist in the self-published version. I do think there was an interesting thing when I wrote it. I was in just really, really exhausted at the time. We'd gone through a lot of sort of difficult, busy time. And I was sitting trying to write this in the first, I think I was in the first, no, it was when I was writing the bath scene. So I'd written the original one in the first round of edits, and I added the bath scene in the second round of edits, at which point I was actually severely jet lagged after coming back from Worldcon in Dublin. And I have discovered through this, you know, process of re-releasing and re-editing things with Orbit, that when I'm really exhausted, I accidentally fall into writing in present tense. I've never written a book in present tense. I have never written a short story in present tense. I have never done anything in present tense. I have always written in first person past tense. So it was really weird to just suddenly just be writing, thinking I was doing everything normally. And no, I had written an entire bath scene in present tense and then had to go back. And I couldn't figure out how to change it. I'm looking at it going, it's wrong. But how do I make present tense past tense? So, you know, that was the level of exhaustion I had reached when I originally wrote this scene. And, you know, fortunately you get, you know, I was able to very slowly chip away at it. And then there's things like editors to make sure that it never actually went out in present tense. But, you know, if I ever say, oops, I accidentally wrote something in present tense, you can be sure I am desperately exhausted and really in need of a break. So that was interesting. Yeah, but I think that's kind of it for the first chapter. It is really quite a straightforward chapter. I was really just trying to get across those elements through those two scenes to kind of make the danger that they're in very real, with the moment with the assassin in Tanaka's room, was, yes, just to try to make it feel more truthfully dangerous, despite everything that you know will go on to find out about that stuff later. So yeah, all right, well, that is my little discussion on my thoughts and processes on adding a new first chapter to Rewrite the Storm, Miko's first chapter. And next week we will go on to talk about Ra's first chapter, which was the original very first chapter in the self-published version. So join me next week to chat about Ra and why I wrote that chapter the way I did. So excellent. See you then. Bye.